Do the ends justify the means? Well, Epic Games' Tim Sweeney certainly seems to think so. Hey everyone, and welcome back to another Industry Report, the mostly daily series where we go deep into the most important headlines in the games industry. And oh boy, today Tim Sweeney has spoken, defending many of Epic's business practices and lauding their supposedly noble goals. There's a lot to break down here. One thing that I think you'll notice is that as we go through his tweets, they are fairly accurate, but what's more interesting is what he leaves out. Because often what he leaves out is actually quite important and very relevant to the situation. So with that in mind, let's get going. So a Twitter user asked Tim, why not politely ask for games to be on Epic instead of yanking them? If it was on every store possible, it'd be way better. Just ask devs instead of yanking games. And I think this is a very reasonable question for a customer to ask. Regardless of the business dealings between devs, publishers, and storefronts, what ultimately matters to the customer is the experience of buying a game and accessing their game, something that is directly messed with by software platform exclusivity deals like with what we see with Epic. Now, Tim responded to this in quite an extensive fashion, saying that it gets to the core of Epic's strategy for competing with dominant storefronts, that they believe that exclusives are the only strategy which will change the 70-30 revenue split status quo at a large enough scale to permanently impact the entire industry. And there's a lot to break down with this, but we'll just need to let Tim finish his point. So moving on, he said that after years of work by independent stores, so basically GOG and Humble, that kind of group, none of them seem to have reached 5% of Steam's scale, and that nearly all of them have more features than the Epic Store. He points out that their ability to discount games is limited by external factors, and he goes on to say this, quote, "This leads to the strategy of exclusives which, though unpopular with dedicated Steam gamers, do work, as established by the major publisher storefronts and by the key Epic Games Store releases compared to their former Steam revenue projections and their actual console sales." Okay, so that's a lot of Tim. Let's talk about what he said. First, on the topic of the Epic Store working, it's actually very hard to tell from an external perspective there. He can only give up numbers that, he agrees with the publisher they can give up, so it's all really down to whether he's telling the truth here, Say that Retro Exodus did perform better in Epic than their revenue projections had on Steam. But the thing is, we're never going to know because the game didn't launch on Steam. We're never going to have a surefire answer there, although given how there is pretty much zero resistance to Steam, and there is resistance to Epic, well, I imagine that it would have sold better on Steam. The only thing that could change that is the Epic Mega Sale, which happened recently, where Epic discounted everything by $10 in addition to publishers also discounting. Now, Epic's $10, or £10 over here in the UK, that came from their pocket, so a game with a list price of £30 would cost a customer £20, but the publisher would still get their split of the £30, which would have been driving higher per unit revenue than, say, a Steam Winter Sale with a deeper discount that doesn't have $10 of the discount being provided by the store. But still, we just don't have general hard numbers. I mean, there's things like, say, Satisfactory performing extremely well with 500k sales by June, and World War Z actually being quite the AA hit, getting 700,000 sales on the Epic Games Store, with it being their largest segment for the developer and the dev CEO, attributing a lot of that success to Epic, saying this, quote, "On the PC specifically, we are performing way above expectations thanks to the support we received from the Epic Games Store." And I mean, sure, but surely they would have exceeded expectations if the game was on Steam and more people would have been willing to check it out there. I'll admit it's kind of hard to see how it would have sold extra copies on Epic given the smaller user base and the ongoing backlash. Perhaps he was talking about revenue though, not sales, with the 88-12 revenue split being higher than what they projected on Steam, and maybe whatever deal Epic cut with them. Anyway, the point here is that we don't have complete numbers. There are certainly games which have been financial successes on the Epic Store, but we just don't know how they would have done on Steam because they didn't release on Steam. And while he says that Epic outperformed Steam revenue projections, well, it could just be that they were successful games and the revenue projections were prior to, Epic, they were lowballed. Anyway, the point is that Tim's tweet's pretty darn bullish, and it's hard for us to say anything either way with any degree of certainty because we just don't have a lot of sales data, though do note that he doesn't say sales, he says revenue, and that does mean that the more favorable split and the exclusivity stuff could also factor in. Now, as for GOG and Humble, well, he is right that those stores do have have more features than Epic, and that they really haven't been able to eat away that much at Steam's dominance, and that is in spite of there being very strong consumer sentiment towards them, especially with GOG. And I do wonder how much of that just comes down to what people say versus what they do. We all know about how effective boycotts tend to be, and it's easy to talk about, say, loving DRM-free games, but it's harder to swap away from using Steam, so maybe a lot of people talk up GOG, but, don't use them. Regardless of the reasoning, though, a part of what Tim says is right. He points out that EA, Activision, and Ubisoft, well, a bit less so Ubisoft because they still will sell through Steam, but they have only done well with their own stores because of the clout of their games. And Tim likely sees this as the proof that if a game is good enough, people will move to a platform. And I imagine that in his mind, Borderlands 3 is that big game that will drive people towards the Epic Store. There is, however, I think a very fundamental difference that Tim didn't really mention. Epic aren't publishing their exclusives. This is not like EA self-publishing one of their own games, and I think that's a part of why customers see what Epic is doing as being a bit unreasonable, and I think for a lot of people they feel like it's unearned, even though from Tim's perspective it's less about that, and it's more about the influence that a desirable game exerts on people who want to play that game, and how in his mind they as a storefront and a developer can band together and essentially do the same thing and move customers over to a storefront that has a higher rev split, which is essentially what EA ends up doing with their own games. And, well, Tim has literally tweeted just that, I believe, 7 or 8 days ago. Anyway, Tim had more to say, so let's move on. He said this: "In judging whether a disruptive move like this is reasonable in gaming, I suggest considering 2 questions. Is the solution proportionate to the problem it addresses, and are gamers likely to benefit from the end goal if it is ultimately achieved?" So that's him pretty much saying, yes, there's a lot of chaos here, but he thinks he's going to justify it. How? Well, he says this: "The 30% store tax usually exceeds the entire profits of the developer who built the game that sold. This is a disastrous situation for developers and publishers alike, so I believe the strategy of exclusives is proportionate to the problem." Now, what does that actually mean? Well, let's say a developer has their game funded and published. Now, their publisher, let's say, gets a 70% split of the revenue, with 30% going to the developer until the publisher has recouped their own costs and the money they put into the game, at which point the revenue split will swap, with the developer getting 70 and the publisher getting 30. That is just one example, but it is an example of a deal I've literally seen before. So, in this case, before costs are recouped for a $60 sale with a 70-30 store, the store takes $18, leaving us with $42. So of that $42, in our example, the dev gets $12.6 in revenue, while the publisher is still recouping their costs, or $29.4 in revenue after the publisher has recouped their cost. Now, I've seen loads of different types of deals. I've even seen examples of just getting a sum of money that covers the production of the game and post-launch for the studio, with a revenue split that is negotiated only kicking in after a publisher has recouped their spend. Now, the thing is that Tim's tweet is worded to say profit, not developer revenue. Now, anyone in business can tell you that profit and revenue are very different numbers. Also, it's not like the 30% store tax, as he calls it, is pure profit for Valve. It is highly profitable, yes, but it's not free money, so comparing, revenue to profit may not be exactly fair. But anyway, let's move on with the rest of what Tim said. So, he said, quote, "If the Epic strategy either succeeds in building a second major storefront for PC games with an 88-12 revenue split, or even just leads to other stores to significantly improve their terms, the result will be a major wave of reinvestment in game development and a lowering of cost. Will the resulting 18% increase in developer and publisher revenue benefit gamers, as such gains are generally split among 1. Reinvestment, 2. Profit, and 3. Price production. The more games are competing with each other, the more likely the proceeds go to either 1 or 3, so I believe this approach passes the test of ultimately benefiting gamers after game storefronts have rebalanced and developers have reinvested more of the fruits of their labor into creation rather than taxation. Of course, there are lots of challenges along the way, and Epic is fully committed to solving all problems that arise for gamers and our partners as the Epic Game Store grows." And that was a big statement. I know I just spoke a lot of Tim's words there, but I felt like it was good to get that all out at once. So, there's a lot to break down here. Is he right that an industry-wide 88-12 split would be a good thing? Well, I think in the indie and AA world, yeah, absolutely. I see people saying that those things don't matter because the money goes to the publisher, and that is actually quite unaware of how these deals actually work, as I've already talked about in this video. Most games exist because a publisher funds them, right? A developer will put their own money into making a prototype and a pitch and doing some development, but the actual full production funding, that's going to be coming from somebody with very, very deep pockets for whom the business of publishing games is really their thing. And there's actually things past that. Publishers also very often do things like QA, localization, porting, marketing, and sometimes even support development. So, all of those things like QA, localization, porting, should a 10-person indie team be doing that? Probably not. Now look, there are loads of problems out there, but I do think that publishers are a vital part of the industry. The publisher and dev will then, of course, have a revenue split worked out between them, so a more equitable store split does actually result in more money to a developer. That is true, but it's also leaving out quite a bit, and this is where I take a little bit of issue with Tim. So Steam are 30%, yes, but they also let publishers sell Steam keys on third-party stores. That means that per game activation on Steam, they're not making 30%, although much of the cost that 30% is, sort of involved in is, say, payment processing, and if Green Man Gaming are handling payment processing, then, yeah, it's not really going to be money out of Valve's pocket. So that whole thing of the third-party activations eating into Steam's profit and bring them down to like an effective 18%, that is actually quite overblown as an overall problem. That said, it's also very true that Steam allow for that entire Steam key market to exist. They actually don't need to do that. And it is the case that the Steam key market does mean that there's more storefront competition. After all, the likes of Green Man Gaming and Humble, they're often competing with each other on price. Now, Epic are a lot more tied down with their support for third-party stores and Epic Games Store keys. They only support a limited number of third-party stores, and I think the details there are not really as clear. I don't know if we've heard of Epic taking, say, a slice of an Epic Store key sold in Humble as an example, so I need to learn more about that. It is the case, though, that Epic can compete against other storefronts because of the vertically integrated aspect of their business. So for an example, if you sell a game made on their engine on their store, they waive the engine licensing fee. That's something that's really quite powerful, and that's something that Valve can't really do because basically no one uses Source in the same way that the Epic, the Unreal Engine is used, and it's something that Unity can't do because Unity do not own a storefront to sell Unity games on. Now, it's also true that Steam will eat all payment processing costs within their 30%. Epic don't. Right? They only eat anything up to 8%, and anything past that, they will pass that price on to the customer. And that is a move that Tim has defended in the past by saying that it incentivizes customers to use more efficient payment methods, which will, of course, damage the businesses of the more expensive payment providers. And on a macro level there, he is right. But the thing is, from a customer experience perspective, it's quite rubbish, isn't it? And it's especially bad for users in countries who do not have that many payment processing options. As always, Tim is taking an ends justify the means approach, explaining things from his perspective, but I would say he just has this thing where he notably does not include important differences in the business model of Epic as compared to Valve, and how Epic's ability to do 8812 is somewhat different to Valve because of a lot of the minutiae of how the two different stores operate. That's not all, though. There are some other tweets to cover. Tim has said that Kickstarter Epic exclusives don't have Steam fulfillment because Valve will only let keys be generated if a game is going to be generally sold on Steam. Tim said that Epic would be totally willing to pay the 30% for each backer key, but that he understands why Valve would take an all-or-nothing approach there. So there you go, that's his take on that. Personally, I just wish they stayed away from games with prior commitments. I think it feels really scummy, really bad. I don't like it. It just feels like the wrong thing to do. Then finally, Tim did also mention that Epic exclusives right now have been very late in the day deals within 2019, but that their 2020 announcements will include a wider variety of funding arrangements, and that likely means them actually funding the development of new games from scratch. At which point I do wonder, why don't they just say they're publishing games? I mean, heck, maybe that's just how they'll announce it in 2020, that Epic Games will be doing publishing work. I think that customers will be more understanding of a publisher selling a game that they funded in their own store than a storefront paying a publisher to not publish their game on another platform. Now, he did also mention that their $100 million Epic Mega Grant has no strings attached, such as for the store, but that also does make sense because that is a part of their engine business, and their engine business does have its own licensing terms of, I believe, 5%. So there you go, that is essentially the breakdown of what Tim said. My take on this is overall very simple. Do I wish that we had more equitable splits? I mean, yeah, I think it would be better if more of the money was going to the people who either fund games or develop games, instead of to essentially what is a middleman service. So yes, I do think that. But I think that the way in which they've went about this is really quite a problem. They essentially I mean, first of all, the exclusives, they are just making a worse customer experience. I think that really sucks. And they're also upsetting the sort of incentives, such that developers can now be pitted against customers. And I think that's a really unhealthy place for our industry to be in. I think it's really bad for discourse. And I think we're seeing that. We're seeing a lot of negative impacts from what Epic are doing. And I just don't like this whole ends justify the means approach. I think that Tim feels really disconnected, like he is there in his ivory tower at Epic Games, looking at his spreadsheets, thinking, aha, yes, great, the numbers are going in the right direction. But on the ground, in terms of what people actually experience, I don't think he has an ample appreciation of just the frustration over this whole situation that he's causing. Overall, I hope we get past this initial chapter. If Epic are going to be funding games, funding new games from studios, a studio takes a pitch deck to them, maybe as a prototype, and Epic say, yeah, we like this game, we'll publish it. It'll be exclusive on our store because we're publishing it, but we'll publish it. I think that's more fair because that is a new game existing because Epic have funded it. And I think that's a lot more acceptable than Epic just saying, hey, Metro, right, the way you were going to go on Steam, actually, here's a bunch of money, you're coming with us. I think that's really scummy, and just the notion of paying a publisher to not publish their game, I mean, come on. It doesn't take a genius to know that that is it's pretty much a recipe for chaos, isn't it? And if you look at the fallout from this Epic situation, I think chaos is the word to use. So let me know what you think about Tim's responses and explanations down below. Thank you very much for watching this video, and with that, I'll see you next time.